The alarm started at 3:47 station time, and by 3:50 the Corvin trade concourse was screaming. Not literally screaming. Most of the species docked at Corvin didn't have vocal cords built for that kind of pitch, but the effect was the same. Comm channels flooded. Docking clamps froze mid-release. On the observation deck, a Farron trade broker dropped a tray of shell fruit and didn't bother picking it up, because the news feed scrolling across the deck's public display had just updated with 6 words that made her forget the fruit existed. Humanity DCLRES War on Council. 3 docking rings away, a Vorthu logistics captain was already redirecting his fleet away from Sol space, muttering into his headset that he didn't care what the manifest said. Nobody was getting paid enough to be near Earth when this went off. On the Council Relay Network, an anchor for the Interstellar News Cooperative, a Galen with 4 eyes and absolutely no poker face in any of them, was mid-sentence when the report hit her desk, and she said live to 900 million viewers across 11 systems, "I need someone to confirm this isn't a joke, because if I'm reading this correctly, the newest member species in the Council has just cut the feed black screen." 6 hours earlier. The Council chamber on Thren Station smelled like ozone and old carpet, which was strange, because nothing in the chamber was carpeted and nothing had sparked in decades. Ambassador Marcus Teal had decided, in his 2nd year on the job, that the smell was just what fear smelled like when 400 delegates were forced into the same room and told to be civil. He liked the smell, honestly. It meant people were paying attention. Teal was 61, silver at the temples, built like a man who used to run marathons and now mostly just walked briskly to meetings. He'd spent 30 years as an antitrust attorney in Washington before the Council recruited him, and he still dressed like it. Plain suit, no medals, no ceremonial sash like half the room insisted on wearing. He carried a leather folio instead of a data slate because data slates crashed and paper didn't. And he always brought snacks, because 4-hour sessions in zero appetite suppression fields made everyone stupid by hour 3, himself included. Today's snack was dried apricots. He offered some to his aide, Priya Anand, who declined, because she was 28 and had the kind of nervous energy that made snacking impossible. "They're going to vote on the Asuni tariff restructuring in the next 20 minutes, Priya whispered. "You need to actually read the resolution this time, not just." "I read it." "You read the summary." "The summary was written by the delegate proposing it. That's like asking the fox to summarize the henhouse inventory." Teal popped an apricot. "Watch." The Threll delegate, a broad, plated being named Ostron Vey, representing a mid-tier mercantile bloc, was midway through what he clearly hoped would be a boring, forgettable presentation about harmonizing regional trade equity standards across the outer agricultural zones. His tone was practiced. His packing was designed to make eyes glaze over. It was, Teal thought, an excellent piece of theater, if theater's goal was to put a room to sleep before robbing it. Teal raised his hand. "Ambassador Teal," said the session chair, a weary Keith Ronnie administrator who'd been running these meetings for 40 years and had the enthusiasm of a man counting down to retirement. "You have a question." "I do. Delegate Vey, could you read subsection 4, paragraph 2 aloud? Word for word, not the summary, the actual text." Vey's plates shifted, which for a Threll was the equivalent of a human's jaw tightening. "The full text is available in the record, Ambassador. There's no need to." "There's every need. I find I retain things better when I hear them out loud. Humor an old man." A ripple of amusement went through the room, not because anyone found it especially funny, but because Teal's reputation for this exact move preceded him, and half the delegates present had been burned by it before. Vey had no graceful way to refuse without looking like he had something to hide, which, as it turned out, he did. He read it. Slowly, the room's translation matrices working overtime to render Threll trade legalese into something council standard. Subsection 4, paragraph 2, buried under 9 other subsections about crop rotation subsidies and transport licensing, quietly reclassified the Asuni Farming Collective's export tariff from developing trade partner to standard commercial entity, a 2-word change that would have tripled their shipping costs overnight and handed the difference straight to Threll shipping contracts. By the time Vey finished reading, the room understood exactly what had almost happened and exactly whose fingerprints were on it. The motion died in committee 11 minutes later. Vey didn't make eye contact with Teal on his way out. "That's the 4th one this year," Priya said afterward, packing up her slate. "5th," Teal said. "You forgot the water rights thing in March." "How do you even find these?" "I don't find them. I just refuse to believe anything's boring until I've actually read it. Boring is where people hide things, Priya. Nobody buries a bribe in the exciting paragraph." She almost smiled, almost. That night, station night, which was really just a scheduled dimming of the concourse lights to convince 400 species with wildly different circadian rhythms that sleep was mandatory. Teal was in his quarters finishing a cup of truly mediocre reconstituted coffee when his private terminal chimed with a message flagged through 6 layers of relay obscurity. It had taken 11 days to reach him, routed through back channels specifically designed to avoid council oversight, which told him immediately that whoever sent it was either desperate or terrified, possibly both. The sender identified themselves as a member of the Asuni Cultivar Assembly, the same small, drought-battered agricultural species Vey had just tried to quietly financially strangle. Teal had read their public file before. A modest species, 3 settled worlds, entirely dependent on a fragile irrigation share agreement with a neighboring stellar system. Because their own home star had been slowly dying for 2 centuries, and their soil chemistry had never fully adapted to the replacement sun, the council relocated them to 1,000 years back. The message wasn't asking for weapons. It wasn't asking for ships or trade concessions or even food aid, though God knew they needed all 3. It was asking for someone who could read old writing. "We do not ask you to fight for us," the message read, translated through 3 intermediary matrices and still coming out stilted and formal. "We have been told this is not something your species does, and we do not wish it done regardless. We ask only that someone examine the founding record of the stewardship accord under which our territory is presently held. We believe, though we lack the standing and the resource to properly argue it, that our current status was never lawfully established. We were told humans read things, all the way through. We do not know if this is true, we hope it is." Attached to the message was a single file, 200 years of stewardship accord documentation, filed under the Drevanth Concord, a name Teal recognized immediately, because everyone on the council recognized it, the way everyone recognizes the biggest building on the skyline whether or not they've ever been inside it. The Drevanth were old in the way that made ancient feel like an understatement, a founding-era species, present at the council's original charter signing 8,000 years ago, and in the millennia since, they had perfected a particular art, acquiring territory not through conquest, which the council's charter explicitly forbade, but through something called stewardship rights. If a species couldn't adequately defend or develop a territory, a stronger species could formally petition to steward it, manage its resources, its defense, its trade, in exchange for a modest, permanent cut of everything that territory produced forever, or until the stewarded species successfully petitioned to reclaim independent status. Nobody ever successfully petitioned. In 8,000 years, across what Teal would later count as 41 active stewardship claims held by the Drevanth alone, not one had ever been reversed. Not one had ever really been challenged either, because doing so required committing to a council mechanism so old, so deliberately archaic, that most delegates assumed it was ceremonial, A fossil clause left in the charter, the way old buildings leave decorative columns holding up nothing. Teal poured himself more coffee, sat down, and started reading the Asuni file at 22:14 station time. He was still reading at 100. By 300, he'd found it, buried in an appendix nobody had opened in 6,000 years, cross-referenced against a founding charter clause so old the translation matrices choked on half of it and rendered the rest in language that sounded almost biblical. The writ of contest, a mechanism allowing any council member, regardless of tier, regardless of standing, regardless of how new or small or dismissed they were, to formally challenge another member's territorial claim. Not through combat, through a structured, resourced, escalating dispute, adjudicated by an impartial arbiter system built into the Council's original founding architecture, designed specifically so that even the weakest species could hold the strongest accountable, provided they were willing to pay the price of trying. The ritual phrase required to invoke it, translated as literally as the ancient script allowed, read, "I bring conflict, formally declared, before the assembly, and I will see it through to its ending." The word the old charter used for conflict had, over 8,000 years of drift and retranslation and lazy shorthand, become, in modern council standards, simply war. Teal read it 4 times. Then he closed the file, finished his coffee, and sat very still for a long moment in the dim light of his quarters, doing the kind of math that had nothing to do with numbers. Priya found him there at 600, still in yesterday's suit, a stack of printed pages, actual printed pages, which nobody used anymore, which was exactly why he trusted them, spread across his desk in a pattern only he understood. "You didn't sleep," she said. "I don't need much." "You have the Asuni file open. Why do you have the Asuni file open?" Teal looked up at her, and there was something in his expression she hadn't seen before, not excitement, exactly, and not anger. Something quieter. The look of a man who has just found, after 30 years of reading fine print for a living, the single most interesting sentence of his entire career. "Priya," he said, "how do you feel about filing a writ of contest against the Drevanth Concord in this afternoon session?" She blinked. The Drevanth, the founding-era Drevanth, the ones with 41 active stewardship claims and a seat that's been unchallenged since before either of our species had written language. "That's the one. Marcus, that mechanism hasn't been invoked in 6,000 years. Half the council doesn't even know it's real. And the translation. I know what the translation says. It says war." Teal capped his pen, folded his hands, and allowed himself, for the first time since 22:14 the night before, something close to a smile. "Then I imagine," he said, "this afternoon is going to be interesting. If you want to see what happens when the council actually reads the fine print on that writ, and what the Drevanth do when they realize exactly what they just agreed to, drop it in the comments and subscribe before the next hearing starts." The council chamber filled faster than usual that afternoon, and Marcus Teal noticed it immediately, because a full chamber before the session even opened meant word had already leaked. Someone on the Asuni back channel, or someone in the archive office he'd requested files from at 4 in the morning, had talked. He didn't blame them. Secrets on a station with 400 species and 1,000 competing intelligence networks had a shelf life of about 6 hours, and he'd used most of that just reading. He sat in his usual seat, folio closed in front of him, and ate his apricots like it was any other Tuesday. "You're not nervous," Priya said, sitting beside him, her own hands very much betraying nerves she hadn't asked for. "I'm extremely nervous. I'm just old enough to have learned it doesn't show if you keep chewing." Across the chamber, in the tiered seating reserved for founding-era members, seats built into the architecture itself, not added later like everyone else's, sat the Drevanth delegation. 3 of them, tall, silver-skinned, moving with the unhurried confidence of a species that had never once, in 8,000 years, lost anything that mattered. Their lead delegate was named Vosk Ilarion, and he had the specific kind of calm that Teal recognized from 30 years of depositions. The calm of someone who has genuinely never considered the possibility of losing, because losing had simply never been demonstrated to be a thing that happened to people like him. The Drevanth didn't posture. They didn't need to. Their entire body language said, "We have been here since before your species discovered fire, and we will be here after you are a footnote, so please continue." Teal found that kind of confidence useful. Confident people didn't check their homework. The session chair, the same weary Keithrani administrator, whose name Teal had learned was Disa Orun, and who Teal privately suspected drank quite a lot of something after these sessions, called the chamber to order and moved through the opening formalities with the enthusiasm of a man reading a grocery list. New petitions, trade amendments. A dispute between two mining consortiums over asteroid boundary markers that had apparently been ongoing for 11 years and would, judging by everyone's expressions, continue for 11 more. Then, any member wishing to raise formal business under founding charter provisions. This is the appropriate time. Teal stood. The room didn't go quiet immediately. A few side conversations continued. A Farron delegate 2 rows back was still arguing with an aide about lunch. But it went quiet fast, because Teal standing during founding charter provisions was not a thing that had happened in his 2 years on the council, and people had learned to pay attention when he did anything out of pattern. Ambassador Teal, representing the Sol Compact, Dissa said, sounding almost relieved to have something other than asteroid boundaries to adjudicate. "You have the floor." "Thank you." Teal opened his folio, not a date, a slate paper, because he wanted the sound of turning an actual page to register in a room that hadn't heard that sound in a long time. "I want to begin by saying that what I'm about to invoke has not been used since before most species in this chamber achieved spaceflight. I've spent the last several hours confirming that it is, in fact, still valid, still binding, and still exactly as written in the founding charter. I'd encourage every delegation here to pull up Appendix 7 of the original charter text while I speak, because I don't want anyone to think I'm asking you to take my word for anything. I would very much like you to read it yourselves." Vosk Ilarion's expression did not change. That, Teal noted, was itself informative. A species that old, faced with an unfamiliar situation, should show at least a flicker of curiosity. Vosk showed nothing, which meant either he already knew exactly what was coming, or he'd simply decided nothing a Tier 3 species said could possibly require a reaction. "On behalf of the Sol Compact," Teal continued, "and at the formal request of the Asuni Cultivar Assembly, I am invoking Founding Charter Appendix 7, the writ of contest, to challenge the legal standing of the stewardship accord currently held by the Drevanth Concord over Asuni territory, filed originally 1100 years ago and never subsequently reviewed." There was a pause, a real one, the kind where 400 translation matrices across the chamber were all rendering the same unfamiliar phrase at once, and half of them were struggling, because writ of contest hadn't been translated into any modern language in 6 millennia, and the systems were essentially guessing at contextual equivalents. Then the phrase resolved, across most feeds, into the same 2 words, because the old root of the phrase, the actual ritual declaration Teal was required to speak aloud to formally invoke it, only had one honest translation available in the modern lexicon. "I bring conflict, formally declared before this assembly," Teal said, reading directly from the appendix, "and I will see it through to its ending." Conflict formally declared. On 60% of the feeds broadcasting the session live across 11 systems, the automated caption system rendered it, instantly and unhelpfully, as "war formally declared." The room did not erupt immediately. That was the strange part, the part Teal would think about later. The actual chamber understood within about 4 seconds exactly what he'd invoked, because half the delegates present had spent the last hour since the leak pulling up Appendix 7 themselves and reading the actual mechanism. A resourced legal dispute, arbitrated by the Council's founding-era judgment engine over territorial claims. Nobody in that room, once they'd read the text, thought Teal had declared literal war on anyone. The rest of the galaxy had not read Appendix 7. The rest of the galaxy had read a caption. By the time the session ended 40 minutes later, Vosk Ilarion accepting the contest with the mild irritation of a man swatting a fly he assumed would be dead by tomorrow. The story had already left the chamber, left the station, and detonated across every newsfeed in Council space, stripped of context, stripped of nuance, reduced to 6 words that traveled a great deal faster than the truth ever could. Teal found out how bad it had gotten when Priya burst into his office 40 minutes after the session ended, holding her slate like it had personally offended her. "Marcus, I'm aware." "You're aware of what specifically?" "Because there are 11 headlines here, and none of them say the same thing, and 3 separate systems have gone to elevated defense posture, and the Vorthu just recalled their trade envoy from Sol and—" "Read me the worst one." Priya scrolled. Interstellar News Cooperative. Humanity declares war on galactic order. Analysts warn of return to pre-charter violence. That's not even grammatically the worst one. There's a Galen tabloid that just says, "Earth goes rogue" in letters that take up the whole screen. That one I respect for its brevity. Teal leaned back, and to Priya's visible frustration, he did not look remotely concerned. "Priya, has anyone on that list actually read Appendix 7? "I don't know, Marcus. I've been a little busy watching 3-star systems raise their defense readiness, because a headline writer needed something punchier than legal proceeding." It's the answer then. No, nobody's read it. They read a caption, and captions are written by people paid by the click, not the accuracy. He picked up an apricot, considered it, and ate it anyway. "You know what's remarkable about panic, Priya? It always outruns the reading comprehension required to justify it. Every single time. Doesn't matter the species, doesn't matter the century. Somebody yells fire and everyone runs, and approximately nobody stops to check if there's actually smoke. That's very calm of you, considering the Vorthu just recalled an envoy. The Vorthu recall an envoy every time someone sneezes near their trade lanes. That's not new information. That's Tuesday." He finished the apricot. "Get me the actual arbitration schedule from the writ office. I want to know exactly how long we have before the first proceeding, and I want a list of every Drevanth stewardship claim currently active, not just the Asuni one." "Why do you need all 41? "Because I don't think Vosk Ilarion has read his own history in a very long time, and I have a suspicion that somewhere in 8,000 years of doing this exact thing to smaller species, the Drevanth wrote down a precedent or two they're going to deeply regret leaving on the record." Teal stood, gathering his folio. "Also, get me actual coffee, not the reconstituted station stuff. If I'm about to spend the next several months proving an entire founding-era power built its empire on unread fine print, I would like to do it caffeinated properly." Priya almost laughed, despite herself, despite the 3 systems on elevated alert, and the tabloid screaming "Earth goes rogue" in letters that took up the whole screen, and the fact that, somewhere above them, an ancient silver-skinned delegate was almost certainly still not worried at all. That last part, Teal thought as he walked out, checking the arbitration calendar on his own slate, was going to be the most useful mistake Vosk Ilarion made in this entire process. If you think the Drevanth are about to get an education in exactly how much fine print they've left lying around for 8,000 years, drop it in the comments and subscribe. The arbitration hasn't even started yet. The arbitration chamber was smaller than the main council hall, which surprised Teal the first time he saw it. He'd expected something grander for a mechanism that hadn't been used in 6,000 years, but instead it was a plain circular room with a single suspended sphere at its center, dark until activated, humming faintly with a founding-era processing core that predated every language currently spoken in Council space. This was the Arbiter. Nobody knew exactly how it worked. Nobody alive had built it. It had simply always been there, waiting, the way a fire extinguisher waits behind glass for the one time in a building's life someone actually needs it. "That's it," Priya whispered. "That's the thing that's going to decide 41 stewardship claims." "That's the thing," Teal said. "Try not to insult it. I have no idea if it can hear us, and I'd rather not find out the hard way." The rules of the writ, once Teal's team actually dug into the founding text, turned out to be stranger and more interesting than the tabloids had any interest in reporting. There was no combat. There never had been. The contest was judged across a series of modeled scenarios: economic collapse projections, colonial unrest simulations, supply chain fragility indices, generational sentiment modeling, run by the Arbiter against both parties' submitted evidence, testimony, and proposed remedies. Whoever's case held up best across the full weight of consequence, not cleverness, not rhetoric, won. It was, Teal had told Priya after his third sleepless night reading the procedural appendix, the single most complicated audit in galactic history, dressed up in 8,000-year-old ceremonial language, so that everyone forgot it was fundamentally a spreadsheet with teeth. Which was why his team looked nothing like anyone expected. Vas Galarian had shown up to the first procedural session with 4 staff: a military historian, 2 stewardship law specialists who'd spent literal centuries winning this exact kind of dispute against smaller species, and an economic modeler whose credentials ran 11 pages. He looked, frankly, prepared for a fair fight against an outmatched opponent, and he had every reason to. Teal showed up with Priya, a retired U.S. Army logistics colonel named Reyes who'd spent 30 years untangling supply chains across 3 continents, and had exactly 0 patience for anyone who thought spreadsheets weren't a form of warfare. A labor mediator named Dana Ockafer who'd spent her career getting hostile unions and hostile management to sign the same piece of paper, and a forensic accountant named Wen Li who had, in a previous life, testified before Congress about pension fund fraud and considered 8,000-year-old stewardship accounting to be, in her words, adorably sloppy by comparison. Vosk looked at Teal's table on the first day, and, for the first time since the whole thing began, allowed something like genuine amusement to cross his face. "This is your legal team," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "This is my legal team," Teal agreed. "I was told humans were unpredictable. I expected soldiers, or at minimum lawyers. We have a lawyer. She's better than the 2 you brought." Priya, to her credit, did not react. The first month went exactly as Teal expected it would: slow, procedural, both sides submitting historical filings, resource assessments, projected outcomes for Asuni independence versus continued stewardship. It was, by any tabloid standard, extraordinarily boring, and the news feeds that had screamed Earth goes rogue a month earlier had already mostly moved on to other things, because it turned out actual legal proceedings didn't generate the same clicks as apocalyptic captions. Teal found this mildly satisfying. Panic, it turned out, had a short attention span. Process didn't need one. Then, 6 weeks in, the Drevanth made their first real move, and it had nothing to do with the arbitration chamber at all. Reyes brought the report to Teal's office at 500, which told Teal it was serious before he'd even read a word, because Reyes did not do early mornings for anything less than serious. "Drevanth military assets," Reyes said, sliding the display across the desk, "moved into the outer edge of Asuni space 18 hours ago. 3 cruisers, positioned along the trade corridor the Asuni depend on for irrigation equipment shipments from the neighboring system." Is it a violation of the contest terms? That's the infuriating part. It isn't. The founding text doesn't prohibit either party from maintaining military presence in disputed territory during arbitration. It only prohibits offensive action. They're not shooting at anyone. They're just sitting there, making sure the Asuni remember exactly who's still in charge while we argue paperwork. Teal read the positioning data twice, and for the first time since he'd invoked the writ, he felt something close to real concern, because Reyes was right, it was legal. And it was also exactly the kind of quiet, deniable intimidation that had let the Drevanth run this exact playbook uncontested for 8,000 years. Everyone knew what 3 cruisers parked on a supply corridor meant. Nobody could prove it meant anything at all. "They're testing whether we'll blink," Teal said. "Are we going to?" Teal didn't answer immediately. He pulled up the file when Lee had assembled 2 weeks earlier, the full list of 41 active Drevanth stewardship claims, cross-referenced against every precedent the Drevanth had ever cited in defending them, going back 3,000 years. He'd asked her to build it not because he expected to need it yet, but because 30 years of antitrust law had taught him one unbreakable rule. The biggest, oldest institutions always had a graveyard of their own precedents lying around, because nobody that powerful for that long ever expected anyone to actually go digging. When Lee had gone digging, and buried in a filing from 2,300 years ago, a stewardship dispute between the Drevanth and a since-vanished species called the Corallan, over a mining colony neither party had thought about in 2 millennia, was exactly what Teal needed. In that case, a rival power had attempted the identical move, parking warships along a disputed corridor during arbitration to pressure the weaker claimant. The Drevanth, then serving as arbiter's advisor on the case, had argued successfully, on the record, in their own words that such positioning constituted coercive presence incompatible with the spirit of impartial contest, and had gotten the offending fleet formally withdrawn under founding charter precedent. They'd built the very argument that would now be used against them, 3,000 years ago, on the record, because they'd never imagined needing to defend against their own tactic. Teal filed the emergency motion himself at 900, citing the Corallan precedent word for word, footnote and all, and requested the arbiter compel immediate Drevanth fleet withdrawal from the corridor under the Concord's own established standard. The ruling came back in 6 hours fast by arbitration standards, which Teal took as a good sign, because the arbiter, whatever else it was, appeared to have no patience for hypocrisy dressed up as legal ambiguity. The fleet withdrew within the day. It wasn't a victory in the contest itself. The actual stewardship question was still months from resolution, but it was the first moment the news feeds, sparse as their coverage had become, ran a headline that didn't have the word war anywhere in it. Drevanth fleet withdraws following contest ruling. Voss Galarian did not look amused anymore. "You cited our own case," he said to Teal in the corridor afterward quietly, without his usual staff around, which was itself informative. "I did. That case is over 2,000 years old. We had entirely forgotten it existed." "I imagine you had. It's not exactly the kind of thing you'd want your junior staff studying." Teal offered him an apricot which Vosk did not take. "Here's the thing about writing everything down, Ambassador Ilarian. Eventually somebody actually reads it." Vosk left without responding, and Teal considered that, on balance, a productive exchange. The second blow landed 4 days later, and it came from somewhere Teal hadn't been watching closely enough. Dana Okafor found him after the evening session, her expression carefully neutral in a way that immediately told Teal something was wrong, because Dana's job was reading exactly that kind of tell in other people, and she was bad at hiding it in herself. "We have a problem," she said. "Internal." "Define internal." Kesh Amrai, our council logistics liaison, the one coordinating our data requests through the archive office. Dana set her slate down. "I cross-referenced our submission timing against Drevanth counter-filings for the last month. Every time we file something new, they have a rebuttal ready within hours. Too fast. faster than reading and responding, even for a species that old. You think Kesh is feeding them our filings before we submit. I think Kesh's homeworld has been under a Drevanth stewardship claim for 400 years, and I think Kesh is terrified of what happens to that homeworld if we win this and the Drevanth decide to make an example out of whoever helped us do it. Dana's voice didn't waver, but something in it had gone very tired. I don't think it's malice, Marcus. I think it's fear. That's almost worse. Teal sat with that for a long moment, thinking not about anger, which would have been easy, but about what Kesh Amrai must have felt every single day, quietly passing information to the one power capable of erasing their homeworld's independence entirely, terrified that helping the wrong side win would be the thing that finally did it. Don't confront them, Teal said finally. Marcus, get me Kesh's homeworld stewardship file instead. Quietly. I don't think we need to punish a scared person for being scared. I think we need to give them a reason to stop being scared. Dana studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly, already understanding where this was going, even if she wasn't sure yet how it would land. If you think Marcus Teal just found the one move that turns a betrayal into the strongest evidence in the whole case, drop it in the comments and subscribe. The ruling that changes everything is one chapter away. Kesh Amrai was waiting outside the archive office when Teal found them, 3 days after Dana's report, standing very still the way people stand when they've spent a long time rehearsing a conversation their hopping never actually happens. Kesh was Thallan, small, quilled, built for burrow-dwelling worlds, with the kind of nervous energy that made every gesture look apologetic even when nothing had been done wrong yet. Teal didn't say anything about the filings. He didn't say anything about the timing, or the leaks, or the 400 years of stewardship weighing on Kesh's homeworld like a hand on the back of the neck. He simply held out a data chip. I need someone with archive clearance to pull the full stewardship history on Thal Prime, he said. Officially, my forensic accountant requested it as a comparative case study. Unofficially, I think you already know most of what's in it, and I think it might be useful. Kesh looked at the chip for a long moment, quills flattening slightly, the Thallan equivalent Teal had learned, of a held breath finally released. You know, Kesh said, it wasn't a question. I know enough. I'm not interested in what you were afraid of. I'm interested in whether your homeworld's 400 years under Drevanth stewardship has the same rot in its paperwork that Asuni's does. If it does, that's not a betrayal I need to expose. That's evidence I need filed. Kesh took the chip, quills trembling once, and said nothing else, because there was nothing else that needed saying. 2 days later, the Thal Prime stewardship file arrived on Wen Li's desk through official channels, properly requested, properly logged, no fingerprints on it beyond a mid-level archive clerk simply doing their job. Nobody was punished. Nobody was named. And buried in 400 years of Drevanth, accounting on a small burrow world nobody outside the council had ever heard of, Wen Li found the same rot she'd found in the Asuni file. The same rot Rays had found in the Coralland precedent, resource extraction quietly outpacing the modest, permanent cut the founding stewardship language promised, decade after decade, compounding, unreported, because nobody in 8,000 years had ever built the case to check. The final arbitration session convened 6 weeks later, and this time the chamber wasn't half full out of morbid curiosity. It was packed, standing room only, because word had traveled that the arbiter's ruling was imminent, and even the delegations that had written the whole thing off as an amusing footnote 3 months ago now understood exactly what was actually at stake. Vas Galarian arrived with his full staff, and for the first time since Teal had met him, he looked less like a man certain of victory, and more like a man who had spent the last several weeks quietly reviewing 8,000 years of his own species' paperwork, and not liking what he found. The sphere at the center of the chamber activated with no ceremony, no dramatic buildup, just a low hum that rose slightly in pitch. the room's translation systems syncing to whatever ancient protocol the arbiter used to render judgment into every language present at once. The contest, formally declared under Founding Charter Appendix 7, between the Sol Compact, acting on behalf of the Asuni Cultivar Assembly, and the Drevanth Concord, regarding stewardship accord standing over Asuni territory, is resolved. Nobody breathed. The founding petition establishing Drevanth stewardship over Asuni territory, filed 1100 years ago, is found to be improperly established. The stated basis for stewardship, inability of the Asuni Cultivar Assembly to independently manage or defend its territory, is contradicted by contemporaneous records demonstrating functional agricultural self-sufficiency at the time of filing, deliberately omitted from the original petition. A murmur went through the chamber, but the arbiter wasn't finished, and its pace didn't change at all, indifferent to the room's reaction, the way only a machine built before anyone in that room existed could be. Further, extraction records submitted in evidence demonstrate resource withdrawal from Asuni territory across 11 centuries, inconsistent and escalating excess of the compensation terms specified in the founding stewardship language, constituting sustained material breach independent of the standing question. Voskalarian's staff had gone very still. Teal did not look at them. He was watching the arbiter's sphere instead because he suspected correctly, as it turned out, that the ruling wasn't finished, and the part that mattered most hadn't been said yet. This tribunal further notes the evidentiary pattern presented in this contest, specifically the comparative filing submitted regarding Thal Prime stewardship accounting, demonstrates the deficiencies identified in the Asuni case are not isolated. Under founding charter precedent established by the Drevanth Concord itself in the matter of the Coraland mining dispute, 2,300 years prior, a demonstrated pattern of improperly established stewardship claims constitutes grounds for expedited review of all active claims held by the offending party, without requirement for individual contest filings by each affected territory. The room did at that point actually erupt, and this time Teal let it because there was nothing left to manage. The arbiter had just done, in one sentence, what Wenley's 41-file spreadsheet had been quietly building toward for 3 months. Every stewardship claim the Drevanth held, all 41 of them, was now subject to the same review that had just unmade the Asuni claim, and the Drevanth themselves, 23 centuries ago, had written the precedent that made it possible. Voskalarian sat perfectly still through the noise, and Teal, watching him, saw something he hadn't expected to see on that face at all, not anger, not the wounded pride of a species humiliated in front of the entire council. Something closer to a man doing arithmetic he'd never bothered to do before, and not liking any of the numbers. Disa Arun, the session chair, called for order with visibly more energy than she'd shown in Teal's entire 2 years on the council, and once the chamber settled, she turned the floor over for closing statement, because tradition, even 6,000-year-old dormant tradition, still required one. Teal stood. He didn't bring his folio this time. He didn't need it. "I want to be clear about something," he said, and the room, still buzzing, quieted to hear it. "Humanity did not come here to win a war. I know that's the word that's been on every news feed for 3 months, and I understand why it's a better headline than jurisdictional dispute over improperly filed territorial paperwork. But that's what this was, a dispute. A very old, very boring, very overdue dispute over whether the rules this council wrote 8,000 years ago still mean what they said, or whether they just become decoration, old columns holding up nothing, because nobody powerful enough had ever been asked to actually stand on them." He looked briefly at Voskalarian, and there was no triumph in it, which surprised several delegates who'd expected exactly that. The Drevanth aren't villains in this room today because they're old or because they're powerful. They're here because, somewhere along 8,000 years, it stopped mattering to check whether the paperwork was honest. That's not a uniquely Drevanth problem. That's what happens to anyone, any species, any institution when they go long enough without being asked to show their work. He paused. We asked. That's all this was. We asked to see the actual language, and we read it all the way through. He sat down. There was no applause. Council sessions didn't allow for that formally. But the silence that followed had a different weight to it than the silence that had opened the session, and Teal recognized that difference from 30 years of closing arguments back on Earth. That was the sound of a room that had just watched something true land, whether or not it wanted to hear it. Priya caught up to him in the corridor afterward, slate in hand, already scrolling through the news feeds, which had predictably gone into overdrive again, though this time the headlines read differently. Drevanth Stewardship Empire cracks open following Asuni ruling. 41 territories face independent review. Somewhere buried in a smaller outlet, a single line that made Teal actually smile. Human diplomats' war turns out to be the most thorough audit in council history. Kesh Amrai requested a private meeting, Priya said. Wanted me to tell you Thal Prime's review filing is already moving forward under their own name. They didn't want it done quietly anymore. Good, Teal said. Tell them I said it took real courage, and I mean that. There's one more thing. Priya hesitated. Voss Galarian's aide reached out. He wants a private meeting with you, not a council session, just you. Teal considered this for a moment, thinking of Vosk's face in that chamber, the quiet arithmetic he'd been doing while the room erupted around him. He thought about 8,000 years of unread fine print, and what it must feel like, for the first time in all that history, to actually want someone to read yours honestly instead of dreading it. Tell him I'll bring the apricots, Teal said, and meant it, and walked back toward his office to start reading the next 41 files, because that, it turned out, was the actual job, not war, not victory, just the long, unglamorous work of making sure the rules still meant something, one footnote at a time. If you want to know what Voss Galarian says when the galaxy's oldest power finally sits down across the table from the diplomat who read what nobody else would, drop it in the comments, and subscribe before the next hearing starts.